Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Psychologists refer to the concept of flashbulb memory, which is a vivid, long-lasting memory about a surprising or shocking event. For example, the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the assassination of Martin Luther Kennedy in 1968, or the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986. Flashbulb memories show how emotions influence our personal history. Although we believe these memories are exact, they often become inaccurate as errors develop over time. With this in mind, what are your memories of 9/11? Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. Greg and I are both excited about our guest today, Richard Beck. Before you came on the podcast, Greg and I were both spent 20 minutes talking about how much we loved your book, Homeland, The War on Terror in American Life. Give us your bio. Tell us your background.
It's very kind what you said about my book. I'm a senior writer for the magazine M plus one. I've been associated with them for about 15 years, and I live in New York City. And in addition to Homeland, I wrote a book about the Satanic Panic in the 80s that's called We Believe the Children. And I grew up outside of Philadelphia. Uh,
Okay.
so that's about my story.
Let's just talk about this book. You were 14 in when 9/11 happened, and you decided to look at the whole event and follow it through and see it how it changed our society, see it how it changed our media, our politics. It was fun for me to revisit that, to because I have as a I understand the concept of flashbulb memories. When something really powerful happens, you have this memory of it and you think you're accurate about it, but the reality is that it sort of shifts and we shift our perception and we forget things and we modify things. And in that context, give us a little background on this book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I was 14. I was a freshman in high school when September 11 happened. And I think that part of the reason I wound up wanting to write a history of the war on terror was, I'm old enough to have really specific memories of September 11, of everything that followed, but I wasn't old enough to be an adult politically. I didn't have political beliefs that I really considered to be my own. It was just sort of, what my parents and my friends' parents all thought. We were sort of West Wing Democrats, I think would be a way to put
Mhm.
it. Um, and so I'd also was old enough on 9/11 that I'd received this kind of basic public school civics and government education. This is what the United States is. This is what its role in the world is. Uh, this is what it does. Here's how it relates to other countries. And all of those things, as the war on terror unfolded, I'm sort of trying to get a grip on how the world is changing around me. And it just feels like some part of my civics education is being revealed to be false or no longer true, with every week that goes by. Um, but then you wind up feeling a little unmoored, like, okay, well, what kind of a country am I living in then? And was it always this way? Is it just that the ground is shifting under my feet? Um, so I got to, I guess 5 years ago is when I actually started working on this book. But I would say I think since about 2012 is when I started writing about the war on terror for M plus one. And I'd written things about, I think the first piece I wrote was a review of the TV show Homeland. And I would write about, you know, film or television that had to do with the war. And then I started learning more about foreign policy. Um, so it was really kind of a decade of work and thinking and trying to come up with an account that was satisfying to me of what the war on terror had done to the United States also what it was for. Because I felt when I was younger in the early 2000s that all of the accounts I was being given, by first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration about what the purpose of the war on terror was, they didn't seem to really hold water. They didn't seem to quite add up.
Mhm.
But I didn't know where to go find uh, the satisfying explanation. So the motivation for writing the book was thinking, well, I guess I have to figure it out for myself, I guess, in a
Mhm.
way. Um,
Mhm.
and I also wanted to write a book that, in addition to providing that kind of analysis, could also have a little bit of an immersive quality and just help particularly younger readers understand what it felt like to be living through that period in real time.
Right.
Um, because I think that there's been a lot of myth making about what the early years of the war on terror were like, that doesn't line up at all with what it actually was like at the time.
Greg, what are your thoughts?
The book is called Homeland, and it's I think it's an extraordinary book. I came across it and recommended that we do it from a review in London Review of Book from July by Jackson Lears. It's a good review, a very good review. The book's actually better than the review. I mean, the review doesn't do justice to it once you get your hands into it. What I like about it most of all is embedded in the introduction, where Richard, you say that you can't understand Trump could not have become president without digging back to 9/11. We have to go back to that era to figure out, to give an explanation of how Trump became president, which you subsequently do. You also say the other proposition you put forward is that crises do not come from nowhere, which is kind of a corollary. And that, again, 9/11 gives you a background. It gives you the steps that lead up to the crisis we're in today, the very deep, profound crisis we're in today. I think that's fascinating. I think your book and we had Vincent Bevins on some time ago who did If We
And if
Burn.
we turn, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
They're different books, but they have the same methodology. They go back at the beginning of this century and try to explain to us how things came to be where they are today. He draws a different conclusion than you do about what can be done, but there's many similarities in that. And I so much appreciate that. If you could maybe go into some of that and into how 9/11 as an event and the government's response to 9/11 leads us to where we are today.
Well, yeah, I think that that's another thing that I felt during, the Trump years starting in 2016 is we've kind of been inundated with archaeologies of Trumpism, right? Everyone's got their account of, well, this is where Trump came from. This is where this wing of the Republican Party came from. And I've been puzzled by a lot of those accounts because I see a lot of them going back to the late 80s, early 90s, and focusing on figures like maybe Pat Buchanan, um, David Duke, the sort of radical right, and trying to show how the radical right eventually produced Trumpism, which uh, I'm not going to deny the similarities. We've been inundated since 2016 with what you could think of as archaeologies of Trumpism. These sort of, where did Trumpism come from? How did Trumpism come to power? And I have found myself frequently being somewhat puzzled by these. They, especially the ones that tend to go back to, say, the late 80s or early 90s. And you'll hear them talk about figures like Pat Buchanan, David Duke, the radical right, moral majority, the role that sort of cynical evangelical Christians play in all of this, etc., um, which I think wind up describing Trump as a real deviation from what American politics was up until 2016 and a real rupture with what the Republican Party in particular was like before 2016. And, without rejecting those analyses in their entirety, um, the reason why they confuse me sometimes is I'd say, well, you're skipping over the war on terror, which the line from 9/11 through George W. Bush, the war on terror, that's much more straightforward to Trump. When you think about Trump's Muslim ban, which was greeted with, a lot of protests when he first imposed it back in 2017. When I heard that being described as unprecedented, I said, well, you got to be kidding me. The government was rounding up migrants and Muslims after 9/11 immediately. The war on terror started in the United States. It didn't start in Afghanistan because before we'd even sent special forces into Afghanistan in secret, the FBI was just picking up migrants, sort of mass roundups, and deporting them. That didn't start with Trump. That wasn't Trump's idea, and he didn't get the idea from Pat Buchanan. The precedent was clearly set by George W. Bush. Um, or even as I get into at the end of the book, you look at one of the real defining aspects of Trump is this kind of Teflon quality that he has. Like it doesn't matter what he says, what he does, it all seems to redound to his benefit. The idea that he'll ever be punished for any of the myriad of crimes he's committed over the last decade seems farcical. Um, well, that also has its precedent in the war on terror and in something that I call impunity culture. I watched as no one responsible for the government's torture program was held accountable in any meaningful way. Um, and not just within the Bush administration, but then Obama takes power and makes a point of not holding anyone accountable for that. Um, you talk about, and this sort of spread beyond the war as well, because Obama also failed to hold any of the bankers accountable who precipitated the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So I just think that if you actually want to understand why the US is in the predicament it's currently in, you should be looking at 9/11 and what followed out from that. I think that line is very straight, very, very straightforward.
And that's what I like so much about the book is you'll take one event, one little thing that happened because as a result of 9/11. Let's just say Judith Miller. It exemplified how the press was stenographers and not reporters. The whole country was literally shaped, molded, and propagandized. What do they call it? From the
Paper of record.
newspaper of record, and it turned out to be full of mendacity. How the cable news network erupted after this and really didn't serve us well, I think, in journalism. I'm not saying the big three were wonderful before and Cronkite was God, but it certainly created problems. Um, so that's just one little aspect of the ripple effect of all of this. The idea of the homeland. You mentioned briefly, we didn't talk about the homeland. Nazis talked about homeland, and all of a sudden this becomes this rallying point of our patriotism. And if the Dixie Chicks having the audacity to complain a little bit about Bush, and they're just, they're immediately censored, and all of those things just were new and now they're normal. you know yeah, we don't expect to get accurate news reporting. And then N plus one does, and a few,
It doesn't,
you
it
know
doesn't take anything away from that thesis to point out, because Pat and I are much older than you are, that these things come up again and again. I mean, it was a qualitative change in each of these elements that we've talked about. It wasn't new. For example,
Right.
torture existed in this. We just didn't talk about it, and no one ever had the audacity to actually spit it out and say, yes, it's okay to torture. And
I
that was
think
what was
that's
different.
Yeah, I think that's one of the shifts that you can say, is specific to the war on terror, and this has to do with this impunity culture I'm talking about, is that it's not just that the US is involved in torturing people it's captured. It's that government officials are defending the practice,
Yes.
in public, and not just Dick Cheney, right? Like I'm talking like Chuck Schumer, um,
Hmm.
all of which tends to get conveniently forgotten. But Chuck Schumer gave this speech that I talk about in the book, and this is after Abu Ghraib had become an enormous scandal. And Chuck Schumer said, I think we all need to cool out a little bit about this. Like, you and I all know that if we had a guy who knew where the nuke was waiting to go off in lower Manhattan, we'd all be fine with torturing him. Forget that like sort of 24 style scenario is completely ludicrous and not something that happens in reality. This is the current leader of the Democratic Party today saying back then, yeah, we know that torture is not great, but like, come on, sometimes you got to do it. Um, that the extent to which people embraced explicitly a kind of brutality and a disregard for human rights, international law, whatever you want to call it. Um, Whereas previously they might have just sort of winked at it and tolerated it. That is something that I think was new at the time.
Yeah, and normalizes this, which was I believe I got a few notes, and I'm just going to jump around in a random, looking
Sure.
for a squirrel. I want you. I liked part of this about your book, and again, I'll put this up here. But here's a few of the super movies that came as a result of this: the Batman movies and the Iron Man, and so forth. And you talked about how popular culture just sort of brought all of this these superhero movies were basically exposés of our war on terrorism. And it was
Yeah,
this. Go ahead.
the superhero movies you could think of superhero movies are one way, that Americans as a mass culture kind of processed what the war
Right,
on terror was.
right.
Uh, I found the idealized figure who was fighting it, who's the kind of figure you can celebrate, working through our anxieties about, whether it's a good war to be fighting or not. Um, I say in the book that I don't think Donald Trump could have become president if 9/11 hadn't happened. I don't think I say this next thing in the book, but I believe it just as strongly, which is I don't think there's such a thing as the Marvel Cinematic Universe if 9/11 doesn't happen.
Hmm.
Uh, this turn that comic book movies take away from the cartoonish and toward the ostensibly more serious, that begins, within a few years of 9/11 taking place. It starts with Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. Um, but Iron Man as well, especially the first one, Tony Stark is a weapons contractor traveling to Afghanistan to sell fancy new missiles to the US military. Um, and the comic book hero was also a perfect kind of figure for the war on terror period because the type of soldier who really got idealized during the war on terror was the special forces soldier, right? It's no longer infantry, it's no longer even a marine, it's not a jet pilot like it would have been in the 80s. It's the Navy SEAL. It's the
Mhm.
Army Ranger. That's kind of the heroic figure after 9/11. And the comic book hero Iron Man or Batman is a good analog for the special forces soldier. They're supported by limitless amounts of technology. They've got flexible, lightweight armor. They have global satellite communications to anywhere in the world at any moment. They're extremely agile. Um, the Batman movies, in particular, are all three of them about the war on terror in a pretty explicit way.
Yeah.
Couldn't we say that the war on terror is, however, a continuation of the Cold War? It's the replacement for our moment of the Cold War. As the Cold War disappeared in 1991, we have in 2001 an event um, that replaces that as, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. there are enemies out there, they're under your bed. I mean, the logic of it is very similar to Cold War logic. And when we look at movies, we had the same phenomenon in the 50s. We had these alien movies,
Hmm.
these movies from outer space, these invaders, these pods that opened up and became these monsters that took us on. So we've had a kind of a culture to fit each of these periods. And maybe a broader lesson to draw from this is that that's kind of the nature of our world. I mean, of our particular world in the new world. That's the way we do things. That's the way our leaders control us. That's the way our leaders uh, compel us to get on their with their agenda.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. I think that the Cold War and the War on Terror are responding to different phenomena in the world, but I think that the rhetorical tactics that get sort of mobilized to gin up support for them are similar. And part of what I also talk about in the book is, I go back pretty far into the colonial history of the United States
Mhm.
and the the kind of rhetoric that came out of the Indian Wars before the U.S. had even been established as an independent nation. There's a really wonderful book that I mentioned in my book that Susan Faludi wrote in 2007, I think, called The Terror Dream, which is all about kind of like these deep historical sources of American anxieties about fighting not just Native American, not just Native Americans, but then terrorists in the 21st century, and this kind of vocabulary that got built up around fighting Indians in the colonial period that can get reactivated at moments of trauma or stress or panic. And that's certainly what happened after September 11.
Do you think those are psychological, or do you think they're deep-seated political economic phenomena? In other words, are they of use to our ruling class? I mean, do they function in that way? Are they functional? They're not just mere peculiarities of the American mentality. They have to do with functionality. No.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think that if they weren't useful, they wouldn't get used, if that makes
Right.
any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that one of the ironies of the rhetoric immediately after 9/11 is one phrase that people said over and over is, we've never fought a war like this before, like the one we're about to fight, the war on terror. We're used to fighting World War II, where big groups of soldiers confront each other across the battlefield. And this war is going to be unlike anything we've done before. And that's just totally ludicrous. Guerrilla warfare against an enemy that is vastly inferior in terms of the economic resources it has access to. That's how America started out. America's fought that is actually the kind of war that America is the most used to fighting.
Hmm.
Um, it's the entire westward expansion was that war happening over and over and over. So this idea that, oh, this is unprecedented, everything's changed, we've never had a conflict like this. No, actually, it was deeply, deeply familiar.
This reminds me of Greg introduced me to Gramsci. Greg writes for ML Today, Marxist-Leninist Today, and he did a really good expose about Antonio Gramsci and how the right is now taking his cultural hegemony theories and using them. That the way in which you grab and change culture is you go right to the institutions and the memes that help define it. Look what happened after Vietnam War with all of the Rambo movies. We completely
Yeah.
redefined our relationship with Vietnam with this kind of, we should have just nuked them and macho, and that's what your superhero chapters are about. That we're redefining, we're changing society's views about these things in kind of a Naomi Klein shock doctrine, taking advantage of the trauma that's occurring. I don't know. Is
Yeah,
that too bizarre, or is that correct?
no, I think that's right. And I think that you see this in rhetoric around Vietnam as well, but this kind of guerrilla warfare this asymmetric warfare that the US engages in so frequently. After Vietnam, there was this whole rhetoric about, well, the soldiers should have been allowed to finish the job, right? The
Hmm.
idea was that, of course, we could have won. It's just that America's politicians were too cowardly, and the college kids protesting on campuses undermine national resolve, et cetera, et cetera. None of which is true. America lost in Vietnam because it got beat decisively by the people who were fighting in the country they'd invaded. Um, but you also see, similarly, this idea that because our enemies are more barbaric and more savage than we are, America can't win if it always plays by the rules, because our enemies have no rules. And you heard this all the time after 9/11 that, well, why did bin Laden attack the United States? It's because many Muslims, for no rational reason, just hate America's freedoms. They just can't stand the fact that we're so free over here, and they're lashing out for no good reason. Um, and that ended up being a justification for torture. This
Right.
is, you can't fight them by conventional means. This is the only language you can expect these quote unquote brutes to understand. And that's a big part of why Batman, I think, is the resonant war on terror superhero figure, because his whole shtick is that he has a self-imposed rule that he's not allowed to kill anybody. He can beat you up, he can knock your lights out, but he can't shoot you and he can't kill you. And in the second movie of that trilogy, where Heath Ledger plays the Joker, Heath Ledger is taunting Batman all the time, saying, well, if you want to beat me, you're going to have to break your one unbreakable rule. You're going to have to kill me, trying to goad him into it. And part of Batman's victory is that he both does and doesn't break his unbreakable rules, right? He doesn't kill the Joker, but he does carry out illegal mass surveillance on everyone in Gotham. So, you
Well,
know,
your best part though is the Iron Man, who's this wealthy billionaire who's doing all of this great technology, and it's going to be done in the United States. And they have a little quip in the movie. Oh, but of course, when we do the manufacturing, we're going to go offshore to
no,
South.
that's Batman as well.
Oh, is that Batman as well? That was
Yeah,
just
and
that was hilarious.
that was so
We'll offshore the manufacturing.
it was so striking to, I mean, Batman, in those movies, Batman really is, the United States, and Gotham is the world. And it's when he's trying to get all of his gadgets built as he's becoming Batman. And there's this throwaway line where his butler, Michael Caine, says, well, of course, all of this, will actually be manufactured in Singapore or whatever it is. And it's like, well, yeah, Batman's the United States. You outsource the manufacturing to Southeast Asia, and you do the R&D here in the US.
I hate to be directive, but I just have so many things I want to chat with you about this. And one is the New Atheists. I was a big fan of the New The Atheists when they came out. That's Christopher Dawkins and Hitchens and Daniel Dennett
Mhm.
and Sam Harris. I used to subscribe to Sam Harris. But they get into the war on terrorism. And one of the things that they do is that they frame this whole issue of the Muslims and the Islam as a value of this religious barbarism compared to the way in which we live, which is through enlightenment. And to this day, Sam Harris justifies the genocide that's going on in Gaza right now because of course they think differently. They have this mind virus that is going to put children on with suicide vests and blow them up. And what kind of a society would succumb to that religious trauma and so forth? Um, that's kind of new, and we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
The New Atheists, initially maybe you could say it was a touch more complicated because, you do want to acknowledge that some part of the impetus for the New Atheist Project was the Bush administration being packed absolutely full of radical evangelicals.
Right.
Um, someone I
Probably.
know, given who occupies the president's cabinet now, all of this seems like a lost golden age. But at the time, the idea that, a John Ashcroft could be attorney general was terrifying. The idea that, Bush, when he became president, that's the most powerful evangelical in history. Was George W. Bush taking the Oval Office. Um, but once the animating force behind new atheism was this racist, Islamophobic. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, just, once the new atheists start describing the war on terror as a conflict between religious value systems, you say, well, you're working from the same premise as Samuel Huntington, with his Clash of Civilizations thesis. It's a total misunderstanding of what the war on terror is actually about. Um, I have a friend who has often said, and he's being intentionally provocative, but there's something to it. He says, the Bush family and the House of Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, those are two sides of the exact same coin. Their wealth comes from oil, whether in Saudi Arabia or Texas. They're absolute religious fanatics. Um, it's sort of weird that they would be enemies.
Right.
But I think that especially Hitchens, once he just decided, "Yeah, I'm picking my team, and I'm throwing in with the Bush administration, and we got to fight." I don't know. You felt like some of these people, like they were missing the Cold War a little bit, or like they wanted some great historical struggle to be a part of. But yeah, new atheism, looking back on it, I think is a sort of a sad episode in the country's intellectual history. I think that a lot of time was wasted um, giving them a hearing, and they all of them demanded a hearing all of the time.
I would recommend your book, especially for people in your generation and younger, because uh, this country is very good at living through eras and then forgetting about what happened. And what you do is you stick all of this back in people's faces, even people my age who would like to forget what the war on terror was like to forget the treatment of Dixie chicks, would like to forget uh, the giving away of our civil liberties and so on and so forth. So by putting this all together, you push it in someone's face. So I recommend that everyone read it. But I think from my generation, I mean, what I would draw from that if I were a youngster is things are going to hell in a handbasket. From 2001 until now, they're going to hell in a handbasket, and we've arrived at Donald Trump and the total chaos of the Democratic Party. But I would say, being from an older generation, I can go back to the 70s. And I can see the Nixon fiasco and my believing, even though I had somewhat of a radical tendency, but I still believed that this country was sui generis. There was nothing quite like this country. And this proved it by dumping Nixon. It's proven that we correct ourselves. We get ourselves back on the tracks. And then, of course, we went through Reaganism and we got way off the tracks once again, and we get further off the tracks. And then my friends that were older that mentored me went through the McCarthy era, and they thought they were off the tracks, and they were off the tracks. This was as close to totalitarianism as we got in the early 50s, but by the early 60s they were seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. So all of this is being, I'm saying this to you because I think you're great at reminding people of how we've gotten off the tracks again, but we have got off the tracks again. And how is there, what do you see as a way out of this? Since it's been a decline and a decline and a decline, how do you see a way out of this? Is it inevitable? Is this like an empire that just eventually falls apart? Are there political solutions? I hope you're not going to say the Democratic Party is our future, but let me just say, let me ask you, what do you draw from this?
I think you were right to actually harken back to the 70s because the section of the book that I was the most excited to research and then to write, and the part of the book that for me I think is the most valuable, um, is the third section, the
You're
economic.
you're you're absolutely right. Greg and I completely came across that same conclusion. Your third section just really pulls things together. Anyway,
Yeah,
I'm sorry I
chapter seven,
interrupted you.
seven, eight, and nine. Chapter seven, 8, and 9. And
Yeah, that
curiously,
was
just
the
just to add in, I was shocked to see that it was really not mentioned in the Jackson Lear's um, review. I mean, I had no idea that was in the book until I actually read the book. But go ahead. We've interrupted you twice now.
I
no,
think
go ahead.
it's fine. I think that so that third section, and this was a big like I needed to answer this question for myself. And the question was, what is the economic purpose of the war on terror? Because I remember hearing all through my adolescence, all through my college years, this is such a waste. This is so wasteful. It hasn't benefited the US at all. Um, I remember Joseph Stiglitz co-authoring that book. I forget the title, but it was kind of tallying up the cost of the Iraq War, and he wound up at $3 trillion. I think the book was called The $3 Trillion War, but the kind of thrust of it was supposed to be, look how wasteful this was. The U.S. didn't get anything out of it, and I just remember thinking to myself, and this is before I developed kind of a politics of my own. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Um, like a country's rulers do not stay committed to a project that is that expensive and that unpopular for that long unless they think they're getting something out of it. Like, I just don't believe that irrational hysteria would be enough to keep the war on terror chugging along for 1 decade, 2 decades, if it didn't serve some purpose. Um, and so in the third section, I tried to figure out what is the way in which the war on terror is in America's economic self-interest. And I think that I won't give the whole answer because it's a complicated one, but it has to do with the fact that economic growth has been slowing down globally since the 1970s. Um, and econ economic growth staying at a certain level is really the linchpin of America's superpower status. That's the reason it gets to act as a hegemon, to use the phrasing of Giovanni Arrighi, which is to say the US is the most powerful country in the world. Yes, it uses a lot of violence and a lot of threats to stay that way, but it's not all violence and threats. Because when the US became the global superpower coming out of World War II, the world experienced the highest rates of economic growth in human history. Nothing like it had ever happened. So other countries are saying, well, okay, we'll tolerate the US being in charge because look at the growth our own country is experiencing. That has been slowing down since the 1970s. And for all of our economic policymakers' best efforts, no one's quite figured out a way to reverse that trend. Growth is continuing to slow. Um, I think that when 9/11 happened, that provided the US with an excuse to kind of rapidly undertake a shift in how it related to the rest of the world that had been percolating and been developing in a slower way for at least a decade, maybe a little bit longer before that, which is to shift more towards kind of a permanent, diffuse, militarized relationship to the rest of the world. Not so much, America as the global economic beneficiary to everyone else, but America as global policeman. America as, okay, well, growth is slowing. That's producing unrest all over, in what we hear euphemistically referred to as failed states. Um, in order to manage those tensions, because we don't have the economic answers anymore to fix a problem like global underemployment, Well, we've got special forces, we've got drones. We will give other countries money to build border walls and to train police forces of their own, to manage these groups of people who are referred to as surplus populations, meaning that the global economy just doesn't have any use for them formally. They have to survive in the black market or the gray market. They don't have the kinds of access to formal employment that they would need in order to live in a stable society. That at its core is what I think the war on terror is the US trying to reconfigure how it relates to the rest of the world so that it can remain the world's most powerful nation in an environment of permanently slowing economic growth. And that process has been very destructive, and it's not going to, I don't think it's going to be successful, but it is slowing, it is postponing the date at which America ceases to be the world's superpower. It's buying America, an extra few decades as the lone superpower in the world. So that part of the book, once I'd worked out that part, I felt like, yeah, the psychological component is important. Like the hysteria about terrorism, that's important. Um, the kind of militarized rhetoric that keeps people angry and supporting a war that, doesn't do much for them personally, that's important. But I think you also need to have that material economic component of it as well.
Let's look at this chart here. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's the economic growth from the 40s to today. And from the 60s to the 80s, productivity and hourly compensation was just going right together. It was, what do they call that era, Greg, when the remarkable growth?
Well, they've Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years from the war to the 70s, the early
Right.
70s, or late
And then
60s.
you hit 80, and then the neoliberalism comes
Well,
in and full.
let's step back. Let's step back
Okay,
for a
you
minute. I
you're
mean, I think
better.
that's a very important document. You sent it to me earlier today, and I think it's something that we should attend to anytime we have a discussion of economics. But it also, I think, reflects a little of the weakness of chapter 7, 8, and 9. I think the strength of it, the powerful strength, is to go looking for political economic reasons for the war on terror. And I think that's what's so missing in most of the discussions of that era. But I think the reality is that it wasn't the fastest growth ever. Of course, the Industrial Revolution was the fastest growth ever in history. And and uh, and as you point out, the GDP notion only existed from Kuznets and on. So it's not fair to go back and look at the history of capitalism, and anoint that as the fastest growth. It was a remarkable period of growth for Western Europe, and it was created because of the Marshall Plan largely. And what it created was a monster. And this is where Brenner, I think, is much more important, which you cite extensively, than Arrighi. And what Brenner says in an important book he wrote, was made into a book by Verso in the late 90s. He noted that that was a period of intense, the 70s was a period of intense competition. It was the rebound from the Marshall era. That was when the industries in Japan, the industries in Germany, the industries in Europe in general were more sophisticated, because we had our period of monopoly capital. We sat on our laurels. We had three different major auto companies, one internet company, one technology company, and AT&T, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, they sweep in and they invade the global economy with all new, more efficient, more modern, and ultimately more profitable. And as Brenner points out, the 70s was the collapse of profit. It isn't growth, it's profit that collapsed. And that's where the scramble came with Reaganism and Thatcherism to restore profit. Of course, I got to say, the so-called era of globalization, which I hate the term, had to do everything to do with China opening up, had to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and these enormous markets of human labor that became available, cheap labor, to reinvigorate profitability. And that's kind of fizzled out. That's kind of fizzled out. So that's a backdrop really to the war on terror. And I think the U.S. you're absolutely right. It's not psychological. It has to do with economics. It has to do, some of it has to do with military Keynesianism. That is, a militarized U.S. is the only kind of U.S. that can maintain its global strength, its global position. And its role, we gave up in 1980, as you know, and you point out, we kind of gave up productive production at the same time and moved to financial development. That's the way capitalism here evolved, the division of labor between China and Eastern Europe and other countries, Indonesia and so on, and the financial realm moving from London to the US. So it's a complicated story, but I'm so glad you brought back in political economy because that's what's been missing in most of these
Right.
accounts.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get very frustrated by works of history or historical analysis that leave that component out. I mean, you get so many, I've read so many books written about the war on terror that think that the reason the war on terror happened can be located inside a psychological profile of George W. Bush or Dick Cheney or the people who were in his cabinet. And it's not to say that those things aren't important, because powerful people do have an outsized influence on events. But the idea that, oh, it's just Bush and his crazies in the White House who are the reason this all happened. Well, if that's the case, why didn't it all stop when Obama took office? Because Obama's whole sales pitch was that unlike this impulsive, ignorant, yokel, I am a competent, sophisticated, polished
Sophisticated.
Ivy Leaguer. Um, and he kept the war on terror chugging right along. So at a certain point, if you want to understand what's actually going on in the world, you have to look at political economy.
It's interesting that, you stimulate a lot, so much thinking from your book and from this discussion. But if you go back to, um, let's face it, it's corporate America that's behind this. That's pulling the strings. That's the political economy that's being saved. But the opening to China, or China's opening to the rest of the world, American corporations jumped on that, encouraged that. They told the government, our government, forget about your China hatred, they're communists, all this stuff. We're going to make money over there. And the time turned really around the time of the war on terror. That is when the Chinese economy became more of a dominant economy, growing on its own momentum and shutting out, the U.S. corporations. They were not making as much money from that time forward. And I think that's some of the backdrop, political economic backdrop to this sense that things were going awry and we had to change things economically.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say as well.
And
And
I,
Yeah.
obviously the economic anxiety about China has only intensified over the last 10 or 15 years or so. And that process looks like it's continuing to unfold. It doesn't seem to be slowing down. China is not maintaining the kind of growth rates that it enjoyed 15 years ago. But I think that China also planned for that to be the case. And they said, all right, well, we've built up our national wealth via, the cheap manufacturing of cheap consumer goods. And now they're making really serious inroads into higher value manufacturing. And this idea, even, 3, 4 years ago, I think it was basically a consensus among American policymakers that, well, we've still got a decisive advantage when it comes to making the fancy stuff, when it's like semiconductors. And that advantage has just disappeared.
evaporating.
A report from just a couple days ago that's like maybe that advantage has already completely gone.
Yeah, I
And
saw it
it was
too.
because of Tim Cook literally did this intellectual transfer with all of his he was going to make the iFind over there to exploit them. What did they do? They took the technology and used it remarkably. Same thing with Elon Musk. Went over and built a factory that could build an electric car every 18 seconds. Now their electric car is superior.
We're keeping them out.
I forget what website it was, but I stumbled across a website. It's a he's a journalist, but he's basically an auto industry reporter.
Hmm.
He's like a trade journalist,
Hmm.
and he's American. And he went to Beijing last year for the Beijing Auto Show, which is the biggest auto show in China. And he wrote this piece that I was just fascinated by, where he said, "Guys, no one in the U.S. knows it yet, but the American auto industry is dead. China's cars are so much better than any of the garbage we produce. You can't even believe it. And they're all half as expensive."
Right.
He said, "This is not even a contest."
And they
Um,
charge in 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they got inexpensive ones. I mean, they're really much less expensive.
Yeah.
so I think, that this isn't to say, because I think we've been living with this model where it's like, well, okay, if China is on the rise and the US is on the decline, then the kind of future you might be tempted to imagine is one where China is a global hegemon in the same way in the future that the US has been previously. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that, because China is also facing the larger problems of slowing global
Birth.
growth and
Mhm.
underinvestment and overcapacity that the rest of the developed world is facing. So it's not necessarily that you're going to see America get replaced by China, but I
Right.
think you are going to see America's either superpower status continue to erode. And you could be looking at an era of increased kind of fragmentation. And this idea of a world that is redividing into shifting power blocks without one superpower at the center as an organizing principle. um, that seems to me to be the likeliest possible future now. And all of this, of course, and I didn't get into this in Homeland, and at times I thought I should have, but at other times I thought, well, if you did, the book would have been 1,000 pages long instead of 500. None of this is even taking into account climate change, which is going to be, the biggest driver of change in the world over the next 100 years, I
Right.
think.
Well, I have some good. I'm gonna conclude with a good note. Uh, uh, my sister lives in Twisp, which is the other side of the other side of the Cascades, and it's kind of cowboy country and Trump country. It generally votes, almost always votes Republican. 2 days ago, they had 10% of their population out protesting, and the protest was against the billionaires. That we need better tax systems. We can't have all of our all of this enormous amount of wealth just get pushed up to a small percentage of people. And it just is refreshing because the other great uh, democratic hope appears to be Ezra Klein's abundance, that we just need to have less regulations and that'd fix everything. And
It's
that was like your chapter. You're saying, wait a second, there are economic features systemic in how things are operating in our country that are reinforcing and accelerating some of these negative trends, and you need to stop and take a look at them. I don't know. That's my theory.
Yeah, I
So,
think that both the Republicans under Trump and the Democrats certainly, obviously the Republicans are having a better time of things now than the Democrats are, but Trump remains an unpopular president. The Republican Party remains extremely dependent on Trump, who is aging rapidly. He's visibly declining. Um, the Republican project is not one that can command mass approval, which they know it's a minoritarian political project. That's why they're so invested in dismantling democracy. Um, but I think there's a big opening for someone who's got a different idea about which way things should be going, because I think dissatisfaction with both parties is very, very high. And there's kind of a kind of conservative euphoria when Trump took power again, and high approval rates when he enters office, but it's not durable.
right.
Um, I think we're in a period. I think Tim Barker wrote about this in the New Left Review. I could be getting that wrong, but it's not a period so much of ascendant dominant fascism as it is of a political de-alignment and fragmentation, and where sort of no matter who's in office, people find that they're sort of dissatisfied. And it's, well, because the thing you're dissatisfied with isn't particularly one party or the other, it's with the larger situation. But I don't think either party is doing much to address the root causes of why people are so dissatisfied.
Well, it's probably missed by a lot of people, but on page 452, a study that's most impressive. I read it in 2014 when it came out. I think it's a signal study by Gillens and Page, a study about the relationship between um, popular voting patterns and how people vote and how our political elites deal with that.
Yeah.
And it's a chasm. There's no relationship. They discovered, you say it's controversial, others disputed, but in practice, it's there. 70 some percent of the American people want single payer. They want Medicare for all. And
Yep.
yet it doesn't even get to the floor. It doesn't get discussed in the
Doesn't
House.
have a chance.
Most of the people in this country now are turning against Israel's war against Palestine. And yet, when a bill is introduced 2 weeks ago, there are 6 people that vote for it to cut back on military spending for Israel. And
Yeah.
so this illustrates the study that they made. They made this academic study, and it says there's really basically no relationship between results given, legislative results given, and what people want. It's all determined by elites.
And what that means, just to be a little blunt about it, right, is that if public opinion has no statistically significant impact on government policy, well, then you have to start wondering whether it's accurate to characterize the government you live under as democratic, right?
Like,
That would seem like a pretty basic criterion of what it means to live in a democratic society, is
it
that
would.
public opinion determines what the government does. And I think one of the goals, one of the things I wanted to do with this book is that I sometimes see, especially with Trump, people talking about what Trump's doing and saying, oh, if we're not careful, if we don't oppose this, we might find in the near future, that too much damage is done to our democratic institutions and that we don't function as a democracy anymore. And sometimes, obviously, Trump's project is anti-democratic, but sometimes when I hear that, I think to myself, have you been looking around for the last 20 years? Like I think sometimes people are underestimating how far gone things already are,
Yeah.
and the catastrophe that they're worrying about happening a few years down the line is already unfolding. Um, and you can go back even to before 9/11 if you want, to Bush winning the election in 2000. That is a stolen election.
Hmm.
Um, Under the rules by which the president gets elected, Al Gore won that election. And then it was our misfortune to have 9/11 happen immediately after Bush managed to steal that election. But you think about, oh, if Trump stays in office much longer, we won't have due process anymore. And I think, well, I remember when Barack Obama had an American citizen assassinated with no
Hmm.
due process.
And no
That was
repercussions.
and
No.
no repercussions whatsoever. Like it seems like due process has been kind of out the window for a while. Um, so that's one of the goals of the book as well is sometimes I think that the extent to which Trump represents a rupture in American political life gets exaggerated by people who are hoping to excuse what the Democratic and Republican parties did together for the 20 years, for the 15 years before Trump took office, um, and who want to avoid confronting the fact that both parties collaborated enthusiastically on producing the conditions under which someone like Trump could become president. Um, that's one of the goals of the book as well.
Well, you did a good job. Greg and I give you a very good Yelp review, or whatever. And I see that you get a great review from Greg Grandlin, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He blurbed your book. He was a friend of the show. And also Malcolm Harris speaks highly of it, friend of a show. We need to form one of those secret societies with all these guys, like
I'm ready.
fraternity or something. We're all hanging out together in the same crowd now, so that's
Yeah,
great.
have someone drop off the invitation with the password, and I'll
I,
make it.
this was so fun. It's just great to read a good book and then talk to an author. You're a great writer. Your Dr. Beck, your PhD in literature serves you well, and I will link to your
Sorry, no PhD.
You didn't get a PhD? Gosh, okay.
No, I've never gone.
Pat's going to withdraw the invitation.
Okay, never mind then. I guess then you're not that big of a deal after all, though. Anyway, well, you're a good writer. You're a very
Thank-
good writer. And I want to link to N+1, which I'm a big fan of, and it's bookmarked and to keep current with what your projects are and your future books. So thank you so much, Richard.
It's one of the most important books we've had an opportunity to discuss on this podcast.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind.
That's a good blurb. All right, thank you much. Bye now.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Thanks for having me.